if you are using compound interest method, your interest, I, is the principal, the initial amount you borrowed or you lend, times 1 plus I is the interest rate per period, okay? And to the power of n is the number of periods, number of interest periods actually, okay? And to be specific, the n is the how many times you calculate the interest during that, several years, okay? And then you have to minus p so that you can get the interest itself. And we said the total payback should be the total interest plus the principal or the initial amount you borrowed, right? So this is what we have learned in the last class. But here I want to point out there is a thing very tricky here. That's the n. Okay, so usually we will say you borrow some money from the bank for how many years, and after that many years you need to repay it. Okay, that's a very normal story. So usually, you think that many of years, 10 years, 5 years will be the number of interest period, right? Well, it's not necessary, because you really need to you need to clarify with the bank that how often or how do they calculate the interest. Do they calculate the interest every year? If yes, then yeah, so the 5 years or 10 years, that time period will be your number of periods. That will be the value of n. But if the bank said, okay, you can borrow the money for 5 years, but we calculate the interest every month. Okay, so you borrow for 5 years, but interest is calculated every month. Well, that's a different story. That means your n is not 5 anymore, because n is the number of interest periods, right? It's how many times the interest is calculated. Actually, this is the real definition of n. So in this case, you borrow the money for 5 years, but interest is calculated every month. So you count how many times the interest is calculated during the 5 years. That's very obvious. So you got 5 years, and every year you got 12 months. So actually your n is gonna be 60 instead of 5. Does it make sense to you? Because every year the interest is calculated 12 times, right? Because it's calculated every month, and each year have 12 months, which means each year it calculated 12 times. And for 5 years in total, it's calculated 12 times 5, which is 60. Okay? If you don't follow this, pause and then go back to watch this slide again. Why, in this case, n is not 5, but 60? Okay, I can also write the usual, the easy case, like if you borrow for 5 years and interest is calculated every year. Okay, if it's calculated every year, then your n is 5. No problem. Okay, try to compare these two cases and see if you understand why I said n is a little bit tricky. Now here is an example. Okay, I will show you like how the n changes. Okay, so here still you borrow 1,000 from the bank at an annual interest rate, interest rate of 10% for 5 years. Okay, it's exactly the same as the example we showed in the last class. But here you see interest is compounded every half year. So now what is the total payback? And also we need to remove this annual interest so that the statement will be not, confusing. Okay, so the interest, so every time you use the interest rate 10%, okay, and the interest is compounded, which means it's calculated every half year. Okay, so how many times it's calculated during the 5 years? What's your n? That's gonna be 5 years times 2, because if you calculate it every half year, so every year you calculate it twice. For 5 years, you calculate it 10 times in total. That's why we now have 10 rows to fill up. Okay? And the first row will be the half year of the first year. The second row will be the end of year 1. And the third row is half year of year 2. The fourth row is the end of year 2, and so on. Okay, until you get to the end of half year, the end of the 5 year, the year 5, sorry, the end of year 5. Okay, that's why you have 10 interest periods instead of 5. Okay, now the other thing stays the same. At the beginning, you borrow this much, and then because this is a compound interest, so every time you need to calculate your interest, okay? So your I for the first period will be 1,000 times 10%, which is 100, okay? And then the money you owe the bank in the end of the first period will be the initial amount you owe plus the interest, right? And then we said we copied this to the second period, to the beginning of the second period. And during the second period, you need to calculate your interest again, and that will be a new base. Remember that, because this is a compound interest. So the new base of that will be the initial amount, or no, the amount the initial amount you borrow plus the interest in the previous periods. And here you only have this as your previous interest, so it's gonna be this, that's your new base, times 10%. Okay, and then the new amount you owe at the end of the second period will be the initial will be the amount you owe at the beginning, 1100, plus the new interest in this period, 110. Okay, and then you copy this number to the beginning of the third period. And then for the third period, how do you calculate the interest? So that will be the initial amount you borrow plus you got two interests in the previous periods, right? You got 100 in the first period, you got 110 in the second period, and that's your new base. And then your the total amount you owe at the end of the third period will be what? Will be the amount you owe at the beginning plus the new interest. Okay, so you just keep repeating this process again and again until you hit the end of the 10th period. Okay, and then if you want to know your total interest, that will be the sum of the column. Okay, the sum of the column, this column. All right, so if we calculate it manually, it will give us this total interest and this total amount you owe to the bank at the end of the 10th period, which is also the end of the 5th year. Okay, but don't worry, you don't have to do the manual calculation like this. We said we have that equation to use, right? So same example, but now let's use the equation to solve this problem. The equation is on this slide. Okay, we just copy this. So because this is a compound interest problem, so we use I equals to P times 1 plus I to the power of n minus P. Okay, and now we said P is the initial amount you borrowed, which is 1,000, and I is, let me move this. Okay, I is 10%. Okay, and what is n? N is not 5. N is 5 times 2, which is 10. Okay, what is 5? 5 years. What is 2? 2 times interest calculation each year. Make sense? So in the end, you got 10 times the interest needs to be calculated during the 5 years. All right, so substitute these numbers. So P is 1,000 times 1 plus I is 10% to the power of n is 10, not 5, okay? Minus 1,000. Okay, so it's 1,000 times 1.1 to the power of 10 minus 1,000. Which is 1593.74. Okay, and then your total payback will be I plus P, interest plus the principal, right? So I is, you just calculate it, it's this number. So it's 1593.74 plus 1000. So it's gonna be 2593.74 US dollars. Okay, now you can compare these two numbers, this number and this number, to the form. Exactly the same, right? Which means the equation works, which also means our manual calculation works. But usually when you have such problem, I would like to use the equation method because it's quicker. Okay? So I hope by now you can understand why the n, the number of periods, the interest periods, is a little bit tricky, and how do you determine the correct value of it. That's very important, okay?